The room was still filled with the scent of lilies. Arthur Hale had been buried less than an hour ago, and yet grief was not what filled the air. It was tension.
Cold. Sharp.
Unmistakable. Margaret stood quietly near the front row, her hands trembling slightly as she clutched a folded handkerchief. 43 years of marriage, reduced to a wooden casket and a quiet goodbye. But before she could even process the silence, a voice cut through the room. "Well, I suppose we should stop pretending." Every head turned. Sophia. Her black dress was elegant, impeccable, but her expression was something else entirely. Impatient. She stepped forward, heels clicking against the marble floor, her gaze fixed not on the widow, but on the house keys resting in Margaret's hand. "That house is too big for one person," she said casually. "And, honestly, it's time we started talking about what happens next." A ripple of discomfort spread through the guests. Margaret blinked slowly. "Sophia, your father-in-law, is gone," Sophia interrupted, her tone flat. "And we need to be practical." Daniel shifted beside her, but said nothing. Not a word. Margaret felt something inside her chest crack, not from grief this time, but from realization. This wasn't mourning. This was a takeover. And just as Sophia opened her mouth to say more, the family lawyer cleared his throat. "Perhaps," he said calmly, stepping forward with a folder in hand, "we should allow Mr. Hale to speak for himself one last time." Sophia smiled.
Confident. Certain.
She thought she had already won. She had no idea Arthur had planned for this moment. The last guest hadn't even left the cemetery when the fractures in the Hale family began to show. Inside the reception hall, the soft murmur of condolences blended uneasily with the clinking of glasses. A long table stood at the center, covered in white linen, surrounded by half-eaten plates and untouched coffee. People spoke in hushed voices, but their eyes kept drifting toward the same place.
Margaret Hale.
She sat alone near the window, the afternoon light casting a pale glow across her face. Her posture was upright, almost too composed for someone who had just buried her husband. But those who knew her well could see it, the quiet storm behind her stillness. 43 years. That was how long she had shared her life with Arthur Hale. Every memory in that house, every corner, every wall, carried his presence. And yet now, sitting in a room full of people, Margaret had never felt more alone. Across the room, Sophia stood with a small circle of guests, her voice low but firm. She wasn't crying. She wasn't even pretending to. Instead, she was organizing. "Daniel, we should start sorting things out early," she said, adjusting the sleeve of her black dress. "Paperwork takes time, and delays only make things messier." Daniel ran a hand through his hair, his expression strained. "Sophia, today might not be the right time." "When is the right time?" she replied coolly. "After everything becomes complicated?" Her words were measured, but there was an edge beneath them, sharp enough to cut through any lingering illusion of respect. A few relatives exchanged uncomfortable glances. Margaret noticed. She noticed everything. The way Sophia avoided looking at her. The way Daniel stood slightly behind his wife, as if unsure where he belonged. The way conversations shifted whenever she was nearby. It was subtle, but unmistakable. Something had already changed. Margaret slowly stood up, her fingers brushing against the back of the chair for balance. The room quieted just slightly as she moved, not out of respect, but anticipation. She approached Daniel first. "My dear," she said softly, her voice steady despite the weight in her chest, "have you eaten anything?" Daniel hesitated before answering. "Not really." Sophia let out a quiet breath, almost impatient. "We don't have time for this," she muttered under her breath, though not quietly enough. Margaret turned to her. For a brief moment, their eyes met. And in that moment, something unspoken passed between them. A challenge, a warning, or perhaps a realization that neither of them would back down. Margaret gave a small, polite smile, the kind she had perfected over decades. "Grief doesn't run on a schedule," she said gently. Sophia tilted her head slightly, her lips curling into a faint, controlled smile. No, she replied, but life does. The words hung in the air like a quiet threat, and somewhere, deep inside her heart, Margaret felt it clearly. This was no longer just a family gathering. It was the beginning of a battle. The tension that had been quietly building all afternoon finally found its voice. It happened near the dining table, of all places. A place that, for decades, had been the center of warmth in the Hale family. Birthdays, holidays, quiet Sunday dinners. Margaret could still hear Arthur's laughter echoing in her memory. Now, it felt unfamiliar.
Cold.
Margaret had just poured herself a cup of tea, her movements slow and deliberate, when she heard Sophia's voice rise just enough to draw attention. Honestly, Sophia said, not bothering to lower her tone, I don't understand why we're pretending everything can stay the same. The room shifted. Conversations faded. Margaret didn't turn around immediately.
She didn't need to.
She already knew who those words were meant for. Daniel stood beside Sophia, his shoulders tense. Sophia, please. But she continued. That house, she said, gesturing lightly with her glass, is too large, too expensive, and completely impractical for one person. A pause. Then, more sharply, especially someone who can't manage it alone. This time, Margaret turned.
Slowly. Calmly.
But her eyes held something deeper now. Not just grief. Not just hurt.
Clarity.
I've managed that home for over 40 years, Margaret said, her voice quiet but unwavering. I believe I can manage it a little longer. A few guests shifted uncomfortably. Someone cleared their throat. But Sophia only smiled, a thin, controlled smile that didn't reach her eyes. With respect, she replied, things change. Margaret held her gaze. Yes, she said. They do. For a brief second, silence stretched between them. Then Sophia took a step closer. And sometimes, she added, lowering her voice just enough to sound almost reasonable, people need to know when it's time to step aside. The words landed harder than any raised voice could have. Margaret felt it, not just as an insult, but as something deeper, an attempt to erase her. Across the room, Daniel finally spoke, his voice strained. That's enough, Sophia. But it didn't carry the authority it should have. Sophia didn't even look at him. Instead, she kept her eyes locked on Margaret. As Daniel's wife, she continued, I have to think about our future, our family, stability. Margaret's lips pressed together slightly. Our family, she repeated softly. There was something almost sorrowful in the way she said it, because for the first time it didn't feel like the same family anymore. A relative near the back shook their head quietly. Another guest set down their glass a little too loudly. The room could feel it now. This wasn't grief speaking. This was something else entirely. Something calculated. Margaret placed her teacup down carefully, her hands steady despite everything. Then she took one small step forward. Not aggressive, not defensive, just present. You speak of the future, she said gently. But today, we're still in the present. Sophia's expression didn't change. Exactly, she replied. And the present requires decisions. Margaret studied her for a moment. And in that moment, she understood something she hadn't wanted to admit before. This wasn't impulsive. This wasn't grief misdirected. This had been planned. Long before Arthur passed. Margaret gave a small nod. Not in agreement, but in acceptance of a truth that had finally revealed itself. Then perhaps, she said quietly, we should wait for Arthur's decisions to be heard first. A flicker crossed Sophia's face. Brief, but real. And for the first time that afternoon, her confidence wavered. Just slightly. Margaret didn't respond immediately after Sophia's last remark. Instead, she stepped back slightly, her fingers brushing against the edge of the table, grounding herself in something familiar, something real. But her mind was no longer in that room. It had already begun tracing the past. It hadn't always been like this. When Daniel first introduced Sophia to the family, Margaret had welcomed her with genuine warmth. She remembered that evening clearly, how carefully Sophia had spoken, how politely she had smiled, how she had offered to help clear the dishes without being asked. Back then, Margaret had thought, She's reserved but kind. Arthur, on the other hand, had been quieter, observant. He had watched more than he spoke. Later that night, after Sophia had left, he had stood by the kitchen window, arms crossed, staring out into the dark yard. "What do you think?" Margaret had asked. Arthur didn't answer right away. "She's careful," he finally said. Margaret had smiled. "That's not a bad thing." Arthur had nodded slowly. "No," he agreed. "Not always." At first, the changes were subtle, almost invisible. Sunday dinners became less frequent. "Work is busy," Daniel would say. Then holidays shifted. "We're spending Christmas with Sophia's side this year." Margaret had understood, or at least she told herself she did. But over time, something deeper began to change. Daniel stopped calling as often. When he did, the conversations felt shorter, rushed, measured. And then there were the small things, the ones that seemed insignificant until they weren't. Sophia had opinions about everything. The house was too old-fashioned. Margaret's cooking was too heavy. Family traditions were outdated. Each comment delivered with a polite smile, each one easy to dismiss on its own. But together, they formed a pattern. Margaret remembered the first time she truly felt it. A quiet Sunday afternoon. Arthur had been in his study, reviewing documents, while Margaret prepared lunch. Daniel and Sophia had arrived late. Again. Sophia walked in, glanced around the house, and said lightly, "You know, with a few renovations, this place could actually be worth a lot more." Margaret had paused. "It's not for sale," she replied gently. Sophia had laughed.
Of course not, she said.
"I'm just thinking long-term." Long-term. The phrase had lingered. Uncomfortable. Arthur had heard it too. That evening, he had closed the door to his study more firmly than usual. And later that night, he had said something Margaret would never forget. "Some people don't enter a family," he said quietly. "They position themselves inside it." Margaret had frowned. "You're overthinking." Arthur had looked at her, really looked at her. "I hope so." Back in the present, Margaret exhaled slowly. The pieces were clearer now. Too clear. This wasn't sudden. It wasn't grief speaking through Sophia. It was the continuation of something that had been building for years. Carefully, patiently, deliberately. Margaret lifted her eyes across the room. Sophia was speaking again. Calm, composed, already regaining control of the atmosphere. Daniel stood beside her, still silent, still uncertain. And Margaret realized something that settled deep into her bones. This wasn't just about inheritance. It never had been. It was about control. And Sophia had been preparing for this moment long before anyone else realized there was a game being played. The lawyer arrived quietly. So quietly, in fact, that most people didn't notice him at first. While the tension between Margaret and Sophia still lingered in the air, the door at the back of the room opened, and a tall, silver-haired man stepped inside, carrying a dark leather folder. Mr. Jonathan Reeves, Arthur's lawyer for over 20 years. He didn't rush. He didn't greet anyone loudly. He simply walked in with the calm confidence of someone who understood that timing was everything. Margaret was the first to see him. For a brief moment, something in her expression softened. Not relief, not quite, but recognition. A familiar presence. A steady one. "Mr. Reeves," she said gently as he approached. He inclined his head respectfully. "Mrs. Hale." His eyes lingered on her for a second longer than necessary. Not out of curiosity, but understanding. Then he turned and faced the rest of the room. "I apologize for the interruption," he said, his voice calm but firm enough to command attention. "However, given the circumstances, I believe it would be appropriate to proceed with Mr. Hale's final instructions." A quiet ripple moved through the guests. Sophia's posture straightened instantly. There it was, the moment she had been waiting for. Finally, Daniel shifted beside her. "Now," he asked, uncertain. Mr. Reeves nodded. "Your father was very clear about timing." That sentence landed differently than the others. Very clear. Margaret noticed it. Sophia did too. But where Margaret felt a quiet weight, Sophia felt anticipation. "Of course," Sophia said smoothly, stepping forward slightly. It's best to handle these matters efficiently.
Her tone had changed.
More polished. More controlled. Almost professional. Mr. Reeves looked at her briefly. Not long. Just enough. Efficiency, he repeated calmly, is not always the same as understanding. Sophia's smile tightened. Just a fraction. But she said nothing. The room slowly reorganized itself. Chairs were pulled closer. Voices dropped. People who had been preparing to leave suddenly decided to stay. Because everyone could feel it now. Something important was about to happen. Daniel sat down, his hands clasped together, his gaze fixed on the floor. Margaret remained standing for a moment longer before taking her seat. Gracefully, quietly, like someone who had nothing to prove. Sophia chose a seat slightly forward from Daniel, positioning herself just a little closer to Mr. Reeves. Closer to the center. Closer to control. Mr. Reeves placed the leather folder on the table. The soft sound of it touching the surface seemed louder than it should have been. He opened it slowly.
Deliberately. No ruse. No hesitation.
Inside were several documents, neatly organized, and one sealed envelope. Margaret's eyes flickered toward it. Sophia's did too, but for very different reasons. Mr. Reeves adjusted his glasses, then looked up. Arthur Hale, he began, took considerable care in preparing his final will and testament. His voice filled the room with a steady rhythm. Measured.
Precise.
He updated this document multiple times over the past 5 years. That made Sophia blink. Just once. 5 years? That includes, Mr. Reeves continued, specific clauses, conditions, and additional materials he requested to be presented at the appropriate time. A pause. Not accidental. Intentional. Daniel finally looked up. Margaret remained still. Sophia leaned forward slightly. What kind of materials? She asked. Mr. Reeves met her gaze. And for the first time, there was something behind his calm expression. Something unreadable. You'll understand soon enough, he said. Then he reached for the first document. And the room fell completely silent. Mr. Reeves didn't begin with numbers. He didn't mention assets, accounts, or percentages. Instead, he unfolded the first page and read in a steady, deliberate tone. To my family, if you are hearing this, then I am no longer there to speak for myself. So, I ask only one thing before anything else. Listen carefully. The room held its breath. Even Sophia. But only for a moment. Then her impatience returned, subtle but visible in the way her fingers tapped lightly against the table. Mr. Reeves continued. Arthur Hale has chosen to structure his estate in a non-traditional manner, he said, lowering the paper slightly. The distribution of assets will not follow a direct inheritance model. That was the first crack. Sophia's brows drew together. I'm sorry, what does that mean? She asked, her voice still controlled, but sharper now. It means, Mr. Reeves replied calmly, that the majority of Mr. Hale's financial holdings have been allocated elsewhere. Elsewhere, she repeated. A brief pause. Then the words came. Charitable foundations. The silence that followed was heavier than anything before. Daniel blinked. Charities? Mr. Reeves nodded.
Yes.
Several organizations focused on education, housing support, and community development. Causes Mr. Hale had supported privately for many years. Sophia let out a short, incredulous laugh. You're saying he gave it away? She asked. Most of it. Not gave away, Mr. Reeves corrected gently. Invested with purpose. Sophia leaned back slightly, her composure slipping just enough to reveal the frustration beneath. That doesn't make any sense, she said. What about his family? Margaret didn't speak, but her eyes remained fixed on the document. Because she knew Arthur. And this sounded exactly like him. Mr. Reeves turned to the next page. There are, of course, provisions for the family, he continued. However, they are conditional. That word landed sharply. Conditional. Sophia straightened again. Conditional how? Mr. Reeves didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked at Daniel. Your father believed that inheritance should reflect not only relationship, but character. Daniel's throat tightened slightly. Sophia's expression hardened. And what exactly is that supposed to mean? She asked. Mr. Reeves met her gaze calmly. It means, he said, that certain assets are protected, restricted, or reassigned depending on circumstances. Mr. Hale anticipated. A flicker of something crossed Sophia's face. Not confusion. Recognition. But she masked it quickly. This is ridiculous, she said. There has to be a mistake. There is no mistake, Mr. Reeves replied. The firmness in his voice left no room for argument. He turned another page. The Hale family residence, he continued, is addressed in a separate clause. That got her attention. Immediately, Sophia leaned forward, her eyes locking onto him.
Daniel did the same.
Margaret remained still.
Quiet.
But something deep inside her had begun to shift. Because she could feel it now. Arthur wasn't just dividing his estate. He was revealing something. Something intentional. Something precise. Mr. Reeves paused, just long enough to let the tension rise. Then he looked up and said, "We will now proceed to the next clause." Mr. Reeves adjusted the document slightly, his fingers steady, his expression unchanged. But the room had shifted. The earlier confidence, the quiet arrogance that had lingered in Sophia's posture, was no longer as solid as before. Because now there was uncertainty. And everyone could feel it. The Hale family residence, Mr. Reeves began, his voice clear and deliberate, located at 214 Westbrook Lane, along with all associated land and structures. Sophia leaned forward. Daniel held his breath. Margaret closed her eyes. Just for a second. Will not be transferred, sold, or reassigned, he continued, under any circumstance following my passing. A pause. Then, it will remain, in its entirety, under the sole authority and lifetime ownership of my wife, Margaret Hale. Silence. Absolute silence. Sophia didn't react at first. It was as if the words hadn't fully reached her yet. But when they did, her expression changed. Sharp. Immediate. That's not, she started, then stopped herself. That's not standard, she corrected quickly, trying to regain control. There must be provisions for transfer. Eventually, Mr. Reeves didn't look at her. There are, he said calmly, but not during Mrs. Hale's lifetime. Sophia's jaw tightened. So what? She pressed. The property just stays locked under her control indefinitely? Yes. The answer came without hesitation, without softness, without negotiation. Daniel finally spoke. Dad never mentioned anything like this, he said, his voice low, uncertain. Mr. Reeves turned to him. Your father mentioned many things, he replied. Not all of them were meant to be shared in advance. Daniel fell silent again, because deep down, he knew that was true. Sophia stood up. This time, she didn't bother hiding it. This doesn't make sense, she said, her voice no longer polished, no longer calm. We're his immediate family. We're supposed to move forward. How are we supposed to plan anything if everything is frozen like this? Margaret slowly opened her eyes and looked at her, not with anger, not even with satisfaction, but with something far more unsettling, understanding. You're not being stopped from moving forward, Margaret said quietly. You're being stopped from rushing. Sophia turned to her sharply. This isn't about rushing, she snapped. This is about reality. Margaret held her gaze. No, she replied softly. This is about control. The word landed cleanly.
Precisely.
And for a brief moment, Sophia had no answer. Mr. Reeves continued, as if the interruption had never happened. In addition, he said, turning to the next section, any attempt to pressure, coerce, or influence Mrs. Hale regarding the sale, transfer, or modification of the property will result in immediate disqualification from any remaining family allocations outlined in this will. That changed everything. Daniel looked up sharply. Sophia froze. Not completely, but enough. Disqualification. Daniel repeated. Mr. Reeves nodded. Yes. Sophia let out a quiet, disbelieving breath. So we're being threatened now, she asked. No, Mr. Reeves said calmly. You're being warned. The room felt smaller now, tighter,
Heavier.
because what had just happened wasn't just a legal decision. It was a message, a very clear one. Arthur Hale had seen something,
Understood something.
and prepared for it,
Carefully.
deliberately. Sophia slowly sat back down, but this time, she wasn't leaning forward anymore. She wasn't in control of the room. And for the first time since the funeral began, she was no longer certain she was winning. Mr. Reeves did not continue reading immediately. Instead, he reached into the folder and carefully pulled out something different. Not a standard document, not a legal page, but a set of sealed envelopes.
Thick.
Cream-colored, each one marked with a name in Arthur Hale's unmistakable handwriting. The shift in the room was immediate. "What is that?" Daniel asked, his voice quieter now. Mr. Reeves placed the envelopes on the table, aligning them with deliberate precision. "These," he said, "are personal letters left by your father." He gave very specific instructions regarding when and how they should be delivered. Sophia's eyes narrowed slightly. "Letters?" This wasn't part of what she expected. "Are they legally relevant?" she asked quickly. Mr. Reeves glanced at her.
Some are, he replied.
"Some are more important than legal matters." That answer didn't satisfy her. Not at all. Margaret's gaze softened the moment she saw the handwriting. She didn't need to open anything. She already knew. Arthur had written these himself.
Not dictated.
Not typed.
Written.
Which meant they mattered. Mr. Reeves picked up the first envelope. "Mrs. Hale," he said gently. He handed it to Margaret. Her fingers trembled slightly as she accepted it, not from weakness, but from the weight of what it represented. A final conversation, one she hadn't been able to have. The second envelope. Daniel Hale. Daniel hesitated before taking it. He stared at his name for a long moment, as if unsure whether he deserved to read it. Then, Mr. Reeves reached for a third envelope. He paused, just briefly, before placing it back down. Sophia noticed immediately. "Who is that one for?" she asked. Mr. Reeves didn't answer right away. Instead, he picked up a different envelope. "One moment," he said calmly. He turned back to Daniel. "Your father gave specific instructions regarding your letter." Daniel looked up. "What kind of instructions?" Mr. Reeves met his eyes. "This one," he said, tapping the envelope lightly, "is to be read privately." A pause. Then more deliberately. "And as soon as possible." The air changed again. Sophia leaned forward slightly. "Privately," she repeated.
Why?
No one answered her. But the implication was clear. Whatever was inside that letter was not meant for everyone. Daniel swallowed. His fingers tightened slightly around the envelope. "Is it about the will?" he asked. Mr. Reeves shook his head. "It's about you." That landed deeper than anything else so far. Sophia stood up again. Her patience was thinning, visibly now. "I think we should all hear everything together," she said. "There's no reason for secrets in a family." Margaret slowly turned her head toward her. There it was again. That word. Family. But it sounded different now. Hollow. Mr. Reeves' voice remained calm. "Mr. Hale anticipated that concern," he said. And he was very clear. He looked directly at Daniel. "This letter is yours alone." A silence followed.
Long.
Heavy. Unavoidable. Because for the first time since the reading began, control had shifted completely away from Sophia and into something she couldn't access. Daniel looked down at the envelope again, then back up, uncertain, uneasy. But something inside him had already begun to move. A quiet instinct. A question he hadn't allowed himself to ask before. And across the table, Sophia watched him.
Carefully. Closely.
Because for the first time, she didn't know what was coming next. Daniel didn't open the letter right away.
He just stared at it.
His name, written in his father's handwriting, felt heavier than it should have. Across the table, Sophia's voice cut in again, softer this time, but more dangerous. "Well," she said, "aren't you going to read it?" Daniel didn't answer. Not immediately, because something inside him had shifted. For the first time that day, he wasn't reacting. He was thinking. "I'll step outside," he said finally. Sophia's expression tightened. "There's no need for that." "Yes," Daniel replied, more firmly now. "There is." That surprised everyone, including himself. A few moments later, Daniel stood alone in the hallway outside the reception room. The noise behind the door faded into a dull murmur. Silence replaced it. Real silence. He looked down at the envelope again. Then slowly, carefully, he opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded once. No legal language. No formal structure. Just handwriting. Personal.
Direct.
"Daniel, if you're reading this, then I'm no longer there to ask you these questions myself. So I'll write them instead." Daniel's breath slowed. His eyes moved down the page. "Are you happy?" "Not comfortable. Not secure."
Happy.
His grip tightened slightly. "Because from where I stood, you stopped being happy a long time ago." Daniel blinked. A faint memory surfaced. Late nights. Short conversations. Things he had ignored. "I didn't interfere. That was your life to live. But I watched." A pause. "Then, and I saw things you chose not to see." Daniel's jaw tensed. "There are financial records in my office. Messages. Transfers. Patterns. Not assumptions. Evidence." The word hit him hard. Evidence. "I didn't confront you because I needed you to come to the truth on your own. But I couldn't leave without giving you the tools to see clearly." Daniel swallowed. His heart was beating faster now. "If you trust me, look deeper. If you don't, then ignore this letter and live with the consequences." A long pause. Then the final lines. "A man's greatest mistake is not being deceived. It's choosing to remain blind after the truth is within reach." Daniel lowered the paper slowly. The hallway felt colder now. Smaller. He leaned back slightly against the wall, his mind racing. Messages. Transfers. Patterns. This wasn't emotion. This wasn't suspicion. This was something real. For the first time, he thought about the small things. The things he had dismissed. The way Sophia handled finances. The way she avoided certain conversations. The way she always seemed prepared. Too prepared. Behind the door, he could hear movement. Voices. Waiting. Watching. Daniel looked back at the letter one more time, then folded it carefully, not like a son holding on to words, but like a man holding on to evidence. And in that moment, something inside him broke. Not loudly, not visibly, but completely. Because for the first time, he wasn't just questioning the will, he was questioning his marriage. Daniel didn't rush back into the room. For a few seconds, he just stood there, still, silent, holding the letter like it might change if he looked at it again. But it didn't. The words stayed the same.
Clear.
Unavoidable. When he finally opened the door, the conversation inside stopped almost instantly. Every eye turned toward him. Sophia's especially. She studied his face carefully, searching for something. Anything she could read, control, predict. "What did it say?" she asked, her tone light, almost casual. But her eyes weren't. Daniel walked back to the table slowly, measured, different. He didn't sit right away. Instead, he placed the envelope down in front of him. "I think," he said quietly, "we need to talk." The room shifted again. This time, not with tension, but with anticipation. Sophia let out a small, controlled laugh. "Daniel, this isn't the time for drama," she said. "We're in the middle of." "This is exactly the time," he cut in. Not loud, not aggressive, but firm. For the first time that day, his voice didn't hesitate. Sophia's smile faded slightly. "What are you talking about?" she asked. Daniel looked at her. Really looked at her. Not as his wife. Not as someone he trusted. But as someone he was trying to understand. "There are records," he said. A pause. Then more clearly. "Financial records." Something flickered across Sophia's face. "Fast." But not fast enough. "I don't know what you think you're implying," she replied, her tone sharpening. "But you should be very careful. There are transfers, Daniel continued, his voice steady. Accounts I didn't know about. Silence. Heavy. Unforgiving. Margaret didn't move. Mr. Reeves didn't interrupt. Because this was no longer about the will. Sophia stood up slowly. You're going to accuse me now? She asked. In front of everyone? I'm asking you to explain, Daniel said. The difference was clear. Sophia let out a breath, long, controlled. Then she smiled again. But this time, it wasn't the same smile. It was colder, sharper, more honest.
Fine, she said.
One word. Flat.
Direct.
She took a step closer to him. If I handled things, she said, it was because someone had to. Daniel's brow tightened. Handled what? Your future, she replied. The room went still. You think your father built all of this for nothing? She continued. You think stability just happens? Her voice wasn't defensive anymore. It was confident, unapologetic. I made sure we were secure, she said. I made sure we had control. There it was. The word again. Control. Daniel stared at her. And you didn't think I deserved to know? He asked. Sophia tilted her head slightly. I didn't think you'd understand. That landed harder than anything else. Margaret closed her eyes briefly. Not in shock, but in recognition. Because now, there was no mask left. Daniel took a step back. A small one, but enough. Was any of it real? He asked quietly. The question hung in the air. Not about money, not about documents, but something deeper. Sophia didn't answer right away. And that silence, that hesitation, said everything. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm. Too calm. I did what was necessary. And in that moment, Daniel understood. Completely. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't a mistake. This was a choice. A long series of choices. And he had been standing inside it, without ever seeing it. Sophia didn't sit back down. She stayed exactly where she was, standing, composed, almost relieved, as if something she had been holding in for years had finally been released. Necessary, Daniel repeated quietly. The words sounded different now. Colder.
Sharper.
Necessary for who? He asked. Sophia let out a small breath, her shoulders relaxing slightly. For us, she said. For the life we were supposed to have. Daniel shook his head slowly. No, he replied. For the life you decided we should have. That was the breaking point. Not loud, not explosive, but final. Sophia's expression changed again. Not defensive, not careful, just honest. And that honesty was far more unsettling than anything else. You want the truth? She said. Daniel didn't answer. He didn't need to. I didn't marry you for your mother's cooking, she continued flatly. I didn't marry you for traditions or Sunday dinners. A few people in the room shifted uncomfortably, but no one spoke. No one moved. I married into a future, she said, and I made sure that future didn't fall apart. Margaret's fingers tightened slightly in her lap, not from anger, but from the quiet confirmation of something she had already known. Daniel's voice came softer now. Was there ever a moment, he asked, when this was about me? Sophia held his gaze, and for a brief second, something almost human flickered there, but it disappeared just as quickly. I chose you, she said. A pause. Because you were part of something bigger. That was enough. Daniel exhaled slowly, not in frustration, not in anger, but in clarity, the kind that comes when there's nothing left to question. Behind him, Margaret lowered her eyes, not out of weakness, but out of release, because the truth, no matter how painful, had finally surfaced. Daniel nodded once. Small. Decisive. I understand, he said, and for the first time, he truly did. Sophia watched him carefully, waiting, expecting an argument, a reaction, a negotiation. But none came. Instead, Daniel reached down, picked up the letter again, and folded it neatly. Then he placed it beside him, not as something uncertain, but as something confirmed. "I think we're done," he said. The words were quiet, but they landed with absolute finality. Sophia blinked. "Done," she repeated. "With this," Daniel said. "With everything." The room seemed to hold its breath. "You're overreacting," Sophia replied quickly. "This is emotional. You're not thinking clearly." Daniel looked at her.
Calm, steady, certain.
"No," he said. "For the first time, I am." Silence. Heavy. Unavoidable. Because this time, there was no hesitation in his voice. No uncertainty in his eyes. No space left for control. Sophia opened her mouth to respond, then stopped, because for the first time, she realized something she hadn't expected. She wasn't losing an argument. She had already lost influence. And there was nothing she could do to get it back. Daniel didn't look back at Sophia again. Not immediately. Because if he did, even for a second, he knew there was a chance, however small, that hesitation might return. And he couldn't afford that anymore. The room remained silent as he turned toward Margaret. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Mother and son, standing in the aftermath of something that had been breaking for years. Margaret looked at him carefully, not searching for answers, not demanding explanations, just seeing him, truly seeing him. "I'm sorry," Daniel said. His voice was low, unsteady, but real. Margaret didn't respond right away. She had imagined this moment before, many times, but in those imagined versions, there had been anger, bitterness, questions. Now, there was none of that. Instead, she stood up slowly and walked toward him, each step calm, measured.
Certain.
"You don't need to explain everything today," she said gently. Daniel shook his head. "No," he replied, "but I should have seen it sooner." Margaret's expression softened. "We all see things when we're ready to see them." That was enough. More than enough. Daniel let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Years of tension, of compromise, of quiet doubt, releasing all at once. Behind them, Sophia finally spoke again. "You're really doing this?" she asked. Her voice wasn't sharp anymore. It wasn't cold. It was something else. Something closer to disbelief. Daniel turned this time,
But only halfway.
just enough to face her, not enough to return. "Yes," he said simply. Sophia took a step forward. "This is your family," she said. "Your life." Daniel nodded slightly. "I know," he replied. A pause.
Then,
"That's why I'm choosing it." The meaning was clear, unmistakable. Sophia's lips parted slightly, but no words came out, because for the first time, she understood what had actually happened. This wasn't about losing an argument, or a plan, or control. She had lost his trust.
completely.
Mr. Reeves quietly closed the folder on the table, not interrupting, not intervening, because this wasn't legal. This was personal. Margaret reached out and placed her hand lightly over Daniel's. A small gesture, but one filled with something that had been missing for a long time.
Connection.
"We'll take things one step at a time," she said softly. Daniel nodded. "I'd like that." Outside, the light had begun to change. Late afternoon fading into evening. The kind of quiet transition that doesn't demand attention, but marks the end of something and the beginning of something else. And for the first time that day, the room didn't feel heavy anymore. It felt clear. The house felt different that evening. Not empty, not quiet, but settled. Margaret stood by the kitchen window, her fingers resting lightly on the edge of the sink. Outside, the garden Arthur had once cared for stretched gently under the fading light. The same garden he had spent years tending. The same place where he used to say, "Peace isn't something you find. It's something you protect." For the first time in a long while, Margaret understood exactly what he meant. Behind her, Daniel moved slowly through the house, not as a guest, not as someone passing through, but as someone returning. He paused near the dining table, the same table where everything had unfolded just hours before. The tension, the truth.
The end.
He placed his hand lightly against the wood. "I didn't realize how much I missed this place," he said quietly. Margaret turned slightly, a soft smile touching her lips. "Some things don't leave us," she replied. "We just forget how to return to them." Daniel nodded, and for once,
He didn't argue.
a gentle breeze moved through the open window. The air carried something new, not grief, not tension, but something lighter. On the table nearby, Mr. Reeves had left one final document. Arthur's last note. Not legal, not structured, just words. Daniel picked it up, read it silently, then handed it to Margaret. "If you are reading this together, then I did something right." Margaret's eyes softened. A family is not measured by what it keeps, but by what it refuses to lose. Her hand trembled slightly, but she kept reading. "Money fades, property changes hands, but loyalty, truth, and love, those are choices." Daniel lowered his gaze, because now he understood the cost of those choices. "I could not control what would happen after I was gone, but I could leave you a chance to choose each other again." Margaret folded the letter slowly,
Carefully.
like something sacred. Outside, the last light of the day slipped behind the trees. The sky softened into quiet shades of gold and blue. Daniel stepped closer to her, not as a child, not as someone lost, but as someone who had found his way back. "What do we do now?" he asked. Margaret looked out at the garden, then back at him. "We live," she said gently, "but this time we do it honestly." Daniel nodded, and this time, there was no hesitation. Somewhere in that house, Arthur's presence remained, not in the walls, not in the furniture, but in what he had protected, what he had revealed, and what he had quietly restored. Because, in the end, his greatest inheritance was never the money, it was the truth, and the courage to face it,